In Chapter 7, we start looking at cascading style sheets, which for a lot of people can be very confusing in the very beginning, but once you get the hang of it, it's a great way of styling your pages. Basically, a style is just a rule describing how to format some part of the web page. It could be a single word, could be a paragraph, a table, whatever. A style sheet then is a set of those styles. Cascading style sheets is not HTML. Remember, we talked earlier about HTML providing structure to our document, just like you would in a Word document. You're giving it structure. CSS then works hand in hand with the browser to make the HTML look good. So HTML provides structure, CSS supplies style. Once you create a style, you can apply it to text, images, headings, or any other element that you want. Before CSS, designers were limited to the layout and styling options of HTML. While HTML still forms the foundation of all pages on the World Wide Web, it's not a design tool. So CSS has several advantages. One, you have more formatting choices than HTML. And as we go through these properties, you'll see how that is. Two, you can decide how to tile a background image instead of just having a single image that just repeats itself forever. Three, it takes up less space than HTML formatting. And four, it makes updating your website a heck of a lot easier to do. So what does a style look like? Well, there's several parts to a style. To start with, you have the selector, which is the very first part. And in this case, it's just an element, the same as you would put into your HTML. So it's just the name of the element or the tag for a particular element. It's the same thing. That's the selector. So that's what's going to get styled. And then in between the opening curly brace and the closing curly brace, that's all referred to as the decoration block. Inside of the decoration block, you have a declaration. A declaration is nothing more than a property and a value. So that's the decoration block. Here we have two declarations. The first one, the property is color. The second one, the property is background. The color's value is red. The background color is going to be yellow. Now notice that there's no equal sign here. We separate the property and the value with a colon. We also separate each name value pair or property value pair with a semicolon. Now you'll see these written two different ways. A lot of times you'll see them written all in one line, like the one that I just showed you, or the way that I prefer that you do it to start learning, and I'm going to require that you do it this way while we're learning, is to put each property value pair on a single line. That way, if there is a conflict or is a problem, it's a lot easier to read to find the problem. Later on, when you feel comfortable enough, if you want to do it on all one line, that's great. But in our class, we're going to do it on individual lines for the readability and editing portion of it. The other thing of note is that while every property value pair needs to be separated by a semicolon, technically the last one does not have to have that semicolon. But I recommend, and I'm going to be looking for this, that you always end it with a semicolon. The reason for that is that there are times when you'll have a couple in here, you won't have that semicolon, then you'll go back and go, well, I want to change this too. So you'll add another property and value, and you'll forget to put that colon in or semicolon in. And then if you don't notice that, which it is hard to notice that it's missing, you don't know why your page isn't working the way it should. So let's end every property and value pair with a semicolon. Inheritance. This is a nice factor of CSS. It's merely the process by which CSS properties applied to one tag can actually be passed on to nested tags. And this is one of the reasons why we kind of enforce the indentation rule, so you can visually see what elements belong to what elements are nested inside of another element. And this inheritance can actually work through multiple generations. So not only the elements that are nested inside of the one that's being styled, but the ones that are nested inside of that, and so on. It applies to tag selectors as well as class ID selectors and all the other selectors that we'll be looking at a little bit later on. The advantage is that it allows you to streamline your styling. You can also use it to apply a style to a section of the web document. So just as a quick example here for inheritance, if you style the font for a paragraph and inside of that font you have anchor tags, strong tags, or any other inline elements in there, that font that's applied to the paragraph tag applies to all the other nested inline elements as well. So they'll all have the same font. Not all properties are inherited by descendants either. Properties that affect the placement of elements on a page, or the margins, background colors, borders, things like that are not inherited. And think about that for a minute. If you put a border around a paragraph and you have anchor tags in there, or strong tags, or any other tag that might be in there, any other element that might be in there, you want a box around a paragraph. If it was inherited, you'd have a box around all those other elements as well, and it wouldn't look so nice. So things that deal with, like I said, things that deal with placement, margins, backgrounds, borders, those are not inherited. And as we come across them, we'll talk about some of them. Web browsers also have their own inherent styles to format various tags. So when you're creating a style sheet, you're actually creating things that are going to override possible settings in the browser itself. This is also the reason why some things look a little bit different from one browser to the other, because they style things a little bit differently. The most notable thing that you'll see that is in all the browsers is an anchor is usually blue and underlined with a blue underline by default. Well, where does that come from? It comes from the style sheet that's part of the browser. When there's a conflict in styles, the more specific one wins out, and we're going to talk about that specifically when we talk about Cascade in a different video. But it is possible to have multiple styles that are going to be applied to the exact same thing. Again, we'll use the example of the anchor tag. The style sheet that comes with the browser is already styling it, and you're going to style it. Maybe you want it to be red with a red underline instead of the blue. Well, which one wins out over the other? And we'll talk about that in a video this week or next week. So where do you want to add these rules? Where does the style sheets actually get added? Well, there's three possible places. The first one is inline styles, and you've seen a few of these. Each HTML element has a style attribute that allows you to add a style directly to it. In this particular example here, you see the style element or attribute here, and then you can see that we're setting the font family to Courier, we're setting the padding to 5 pixels, the border style to a solid, and the border width to 1 pixel. Now, we'll talk about all these properties as we go on here, but that inline style is changing 4 different properties for just this TD tag in this example. So only this TD tag would be affected. If you want to style things for the entire page, there's 2 different ways of doing that. One happens to be an internal style sheet. It's always between opening and closing style tags, as you can see down here in the example. We have an opening style tag here, we have a closing style tag here. and it is always inside the head section, not the body. It's always inside the head. Again, remember what goes inside the head. These are things that the browser or other applications need to know about rendering your page, not the actual content. And then inside of the style sheet, you can then list what you want. In this case, all the H1s now, not just one that might have an inline style, but all the H1s will have a color of red. The other thing of note here is that it has an attribute that's called type. In this case, for CSS, it's always text/CSS. Now, all browsers will recognize this style and know that the default value of type is text/CSS. But I'd like you in this class to get used to putting that in there, so it just kind of reinforces what the type is, because you're going to see that type in several different places as we go through the course. So let's make sure that we always put the type in, and in the quotes for their value is going to be text/CSS, which is just saying it's a plain text document written with CSS formatting. So this style sheet, then, anything that's inside of it would be for the entire page, not just one individual element, as I said before. The other way I mentioned is an external style sheet. This is just a plain text file, again, containing all the CSS rules. You may have multiple style sheets within the same page. That's entirely possible. I've worked on sites with 6, 7, 8 different style sheets. It's confusing, but once you get used to this, that'll be no problem. But basically, to keep it simple here, you might have a global style sheet that just does the basic styling in all of your pages. And then you might have an additional one just to style forms. So you would add that additional form CSS file to your page as well if it contained a form, so that all your forms were consistent across the website as well. Well, how do you link this? Well, you do it with a link element, and it's an empty element, which means it does not have a closing tag. It's just an empty element, and there's a few attributes that you could give this. The first one would be the relationship, the REL attribute. And all you're telling the browser here is what the relationship between the document containing the link and the document being linked to is. In this case, it's a style sheet. The next attribute that you need here is the type. Just like in embedded style sheet, you specify the type here. It's the same, text/CSS. That's just telling it again what type of document this is. It's written in plain text and it's using CSS formatting. The href would be the path or the URL to where that file is. And again, this goes back to week 2 when we talked about root relative and document relative and absolute paths. That would be what's going in here. This is saying that it's in the CSS folder and the name of the file is global.css. And then lastly, there's a media. The two in particular that you're going to see in this class, one is the screen, which is the default, so it really doesn't need to be there if this is for screen. And the other one that we'll implement will be a print style sheet for when somebody wants to actually print the page. But there are several other values for the media as well. You can find them on page 199 on your book, or you see them here listed. The screen that we talked about, the print down here a little below that we talked about, but there are several others as well. The other thing you need to keep in mind with these is not all browsers support all of these, and some of this technology does not support anything at this time. Handheld obviously does. Speech do, but some of the other ones, TV is pretty much, most of them are getting up there and you'll be able to use that, but some of them are still in their development phase. But the ones, again, that we're going to be using is screen and print. One that you'll probably use somewhere during your career will be the handheld as well. So that's a style sheet then that is specifically for that purpose. When somebody's looking at a website on a computer screen as opposed to a handheld, the handheld is a much smaller screen. So you're going to format things differently for that screen than you would for a larger screen. So the handheld would be applied anytime it recognizes that it's running on a handheld. What are some of the advantages of external style sheets? Well, one, it saves you from repeating the same style rules in every page. You just do them once and it's done. All you do is link it from page to page. You can change the appearance of several pages by altering just one style sheet rather than going into each individual page. So if you wanted to change the background, your client came up with a new background image or a new background color that they wanted to put on their page, and you've got 100 pages, do you want to change that background color in 100 pages? Or do you want to go to a global CSS file, change it one time, and know that it gets changed on all of them because they're all using that same CSS page? Also, once a visitor goes to your site and downloads a page that is using the CSS file, all the subsequent pages then will be quicker to load. This is because the browser retains a copy of the style sheet and the rules do not need to be downloaded for every page. The style sheet can act as a style template to help different authors achieve the same style of document without learning all the individual styling settings. So if someone new is coming in and developing a new page for the first time, they've got that global CSS or whatever it might be called that they can start with, and they've got the overall feel for what it should look like right away. Okay, because web pages do not contain the style rules themselves, different style sheets can be attached to the same document. And we talked about that just a few screens ago when I mentioned having a global CSS as well as being able to add the form CSS file for pages that have forms included. And you could also have one for tables maybe. If the page happens to contain a table, you might have a style sheet that just does that. A style sheet can import and use styles from other style sheets, making it more modular in the development and good reuse of what you've already done and not having to do it again. And if you remove the style sheet, you can make the site more accessible for those with visual impairments because you're no longer controlling the fonts and color schemes. It makes the screen readers have less to read, therefore nothing gets in the way and they can get the content to the user more quickly than if they have to trudge through all the CSS for a screen reader. And lastly, search engines only read a limited number of characters. By placing the style sheet in an external style sheet, they actually read more of the content, which is the important part that they need for indexing your particular site or your particular page. Let's take a look at a quick sample of this. And I'm just going to run this in my browser to start with, and we'll come back to the code. But this is how this page rendered. You can see that we've got a header here in bold. We've got a table. It's got two different background colors to it. It's got a darker gray for the THs and a lighter gray for the rest of it. The table itself has a border around it, but each individual cell does not. So if we look at the code for that, you'll see first of all that we actually are linking a style sheet that contains the styling. And if we look down a little bit further, you'll see that all the TDs, at least the first TD, has a class of code in them all. And we're going to talk about all these different type of selectors later, but if we go now to our CSS, you'll see first of all we've got styling for the entire body, setting the background color to white, or the color to black and the background color to white, setting the font family at Arial. We're styling all the H1s, setting the font size to 18 pixels, overriding what the browser might have for it. Same with all the paragraphs, changing the font size to 12 pixels. We're doing some work on the table, setting the background color to that darker gray, setting the border color or border style to solid. It's 1 pixel and it's almost a black. It's a real deep gray. And the THs. So these and TDs. These are all styling these elements. So all of these apply to all the TDs, all the THs, all the tables, and so forth. And then lastly, we have that class, where all the TDs with a class of code, we're changing the font family from Arial, which would have been inherited from the body up here. We're changing it from that to Courier, and we're setting the font weight to bold. So if we go back to this, you can see the difference in the fonts, and you see that these are indeed Courier as opposed to the Arial that everything else is, and they're bold. So those are some examples of how you might do that. And then this example doesn't have it, but we could also do an inline style. Come back to this and go to this paragraph tag and do an inline style. Styles in quotes, but we still use the same formatting for inline styles. So if we set the color to a blue, make sure we close the quote. So now that we have that, if we run this, the actual paragraph tag now is going to be blue. So we'll save this, go back out to our browser and refresh it. And you see now that the text has actually turned blue. So that's an inline style. Now in all fairness, from time to time you will see a link, and you may also see a embedded style sheet as well. Remember, a style element is a container tag, and I'm just going to take the color then for that paragraph. We use a paragraph tag, our curly braces. I'm going to change the color to blue. Make sure I close my curly brace, and then I'm going to remove the embed or the inline style. So with that removed, I now have a embedded style sheet that's going to do the same thing for us. And usually what the embedded style sheet is used for is when you've got a style sheet that's being linked, but you want to change just 1 or 2 things on that particular page. Well, rather than creating a new style sheet and linking it for something that you're not going to do on a regular basis, it's just this one exception that an internal style sheet makes sense for that purpose. Again, if we save this, refresh it, we still have the same blue text. There's just one more thing that I forgot here. When we use the internal style sheet, we have a style tag, opening and closing. Remember when we did it as an inline, we had the style attribute. Notice though that in a CSS page there is no style tag. So you're not going to use any style tag in here. The fact that it's a .css tells the browser that it is a style sheet. So you do not, and you do not want to, put a style element in here. You just start off with the elements that you want to style and the decoration blocks. No style element. This is not an HTML page. It's a CSS page, and like I said, by this extension alone, the .css extension, the browser knows that that's styles. The other thing that you might notice here as well is if you want to place a comment, you have a multi-line comment tag that is just a /* and it ends with a */. So I said those are multi-line, so you could put them on multiple lines and it would still be covered as a comment. You can see that it's all still green as opposed to the HTML comment tag. So the comment tag is a little bit different in a CSS page, and you do not need the CSS or the style element. So that's the introduction to CSS.